Alexander of Macedon by Harold Lamb had something to attend to. Just kidding. Hopefully the smoke is clear enough that I can finish this. But Lady of the Beast is chapter 12 of part 2. As soon as Parmenio's shattered command had been disengaged, Alexandros assembled the least wearied mounted units and launched a headlong pursuit down a main highway to the south where he knew great cities lay and where he suspected Darius had fled. Parmenio followed only within a few hours with the main command, pausing only to load the wounded and most valuable loot, weapons, instruments, and bullion, into carts. This time there could be no celebration or delay. Alexandros called a halt to the stream after sunset and allowed his pursuit to force to rest for 5 hours, then took the road again. Within 40 hours he covered 60 miles to the rock citadel of Irbil, almost at the mountain's edge. From this height he could observe the plain where dust layers marked the routes taken by retreating units of Darius's command. Apparently they were fanning out southward and eastward into the mountains, and again this time at Irbil he found Darius's gold-adorned chariot and bow case. But this chariot seemed to have been left for him to find. Darius, he learned, had headed east along a mountain road with the fine Bactrian horsemen and nuclei of the Greek hoplites and immortals into these mountains. Alexandros dared not to follow as yet, because at Irbil he realized the dilemma into which he had fallen by entering this eastern Mesopotamian plain. The battle at Gaugamela had decided nothing militarily. He was still leading some 30,000 wearied men across ever-widening space. Hostile forces lay south and east of him. He had scattered those vastly superior forces at Gaugamela. He had not crushed them. Thinking back, he recalled that, except for some cavalry officers, the force at Issus had not been the same as the affair on the river Granicus. Except for some Greek mercenaries and Babylonian units, the Asiatic army of Gaugamela had contained none of the commands he had faced at Issus. The lesson to be drawn from this was unmistakable. He was leading his 30,000 against a manpower of many millions, a manpower scattered over plains, mountains, heights, and desert areas that dwarfed the Mediterranean coast. Provided new armies could be assembled against him as he advanced, he would meet inevitable defeat in the end. Each engagement would reduce the strength of the Macedonians, while the Asiatics could recruit fresh armed forces from new territory. It was evident already that these lands of Asia could breed new contingents of well-armed and dangerous horsemen. Also, each day's march was now moving the Macedonians further from their base on the Mediterranean. It's like fighting a chimera, Hephaestion pointed out. When you cut off one head of a chimera, another one bites you. You can't kill a beast with many heads until the last head is cut off. No, not a chimera, but Dilemma corrected. This is a new kind of monster, with one head, the great king, and many bodies. No ancient hero faced a monster like that. It's really unnatural. Nothing, however, could be unnatural. Once a situation was understood, it ceased to have hidden potentialities for evil. With his young leaders, Alexandros studied the situation to determine what advantages it might have. It had this in his favor. He could gain, as he advanced, fairly accurate information about the forces ahead of him. They could not know what reserves he had behind him. The tale of his victories had not lost in the telling. Certainly no contingent of Asiatics that had faced the terrible Macedonian attack cared to run that risk a second time. Evidently the Asiatic peoples understood by now that they were facing no force of hired Greeks who made a profession of military service on one side or the other. The miracle of the overthrow of Gaugamela led a paralysis on all this countryside. That happy effect might endure for a month or two. After that, he would have to produce a new miracle, a retreat like Xenophon's 10,000 to the coast. Then the Macedonians possessed the inestimable advantage of Darius. This commander-in-chief, Darius, I guess is how you say his name, this commander-in-chief of the immense forces of Asia was not only a coward, I take that back, he is a coward, little respected by the generals serving under him, because he ran away twice, but a coward whose hesitation hindered any united move against the Macedonians. The Asiatics, it seemed, obeyed Darius not because they respected him, but because they reverenced the position of the great king, the king of the lands of the earth, successor to the first Darius and the mighty Xerxes. Okay, I don't remember how to say that. Who had in turn, either in Greek or in Persian, because I don't remember, who had in turn grasped the imperium of the Assyrian monarchs, whose likeness appeared carved in stone upon the cliff walls. They gave loyalty to the human being who was emperor, the incarnation of the divine power, or so they thought. So the Macedonians were opposed, not so much by the human Darius, who had actually been of advantage to them, but by the concept in Asiatic minds of the ruler who was destined to sit upon the throne. So much being clear, Alexandros acted upon it at once. He had only a small margin of time to encompass vast space. Therefore, he moved with the utmost speed down the plain, keeping between the Tigris and the mountain wall, not daring to divide his forces now, in march columns, prepared for action, himself riding in the newly captured chariot, wearing his plumed helmet and a white floss cloak, followed by a host of captives. This made an impressive pageant. Meanwhile, he sent ahead at utmost speed 2 officer messengers to the 2 nearest capitals, Babylon and Susa. These officers announced the approach of not an enemy, but of the new ruler of Mesopotamia, destined to succeed the fugitive Darius. They summoned Babylon and Susa, not to submit, but to welcome the great new king, who would grant freedom of worship to all temples, who would disturb no provincial government, nor exact tribute of any personal property. Yet Alexandros approached Babylon cautiously. Deploying the head of his column, he passed through dark fertile gardens, over wide canals fed by water pumped up from the river, under groves of date palms and citrus-bearing trees, along wide roadways where the dust was laid by sprinkling carts, and he was met by a procession of priests and officials welcoming him to Babylon with gifts of shining metal and gems and embroidered cloth. He barely paused for the greeting, but pushed on across the great canal, seeing immense walls rising from an embankment, and above the walls the pinnacles of ziggurats and palace summits of terraced gardens towering over the immensity of roofs. In full procession he traveled along the avenue leading to the tiled Ishtar Gate, passing between towers so massive that they dwarfed the temples of Memphis. He rode up the ramp to the palace, looking out over the summits of buildings above the green of trees, where the brilliant sunlight flashed on the gold and black turquoise blue of the temple towers, and he dismounted where the spear-bearing immortals stood at the place entrance. So Alexandros of Macedon came to Babylon, his capital city. Babylon had an effect of shock upon the Macedonians, who found here a creation of strange hands, immense and permanent. There was nothing Greek about it. The sculptor Lysippus walked through the corridors without a single statue, yet glowing with tiles and enlivened by processions of fantastic animals within the tiles. The sign of the Lady of the Beasts, the crescent moon, rested upon the lintels of towering gateways. Space outlined by walls stretching to the horizon gained new meaning here. A human figure walking up a ramp toward a pinnacle was dwarfed by the structure upon which it stood, yet a little investigation convinced Lysippus that these gigantic walls and summits were built out of clay, molded by the hands of slaves, and baked in ovens or dried in the sun. Even the ornamental tiles were no more Then this earth, cleverly glazed, learned Chaldeans showed him libraries of tablets and thin squares of clay stamped with wedges and then dried so that they never yielded to age. Such tablets recorded marriages, loans, and gifts made centuries before. The bricks of the lower walls carried the stamp of Nebuchadnezzar. There's a couple of variations in Aramaic of that, but I think in Persian you get one. But building out of the earth itself, the Babylonians had tried to escape the earth's surface by raising their edifices in step-back pyramids to the upper levels of cooler air. Such a structure had been called the Tower of Bab-El, the Gate of the Lord. Bab-Erush, same thing, divine gate. In the time when the wandering Hebrews had lived by the waters of Babylon, waiting to journey on their Mount of Sion, Aristotle might have wondered at the fertility of this soil, impregnated by the heat of the sun and the constant moisture from the camels. From the camels, from the canals. So that the plant life covered every exposed portion, and human life, sustained by an abundance of food, multiplied itself swiftly. The Macedonians marveled briefly at these waters of life. They considered that these hanging gardens of Babylon were a great wonder of the world. Then the mausoleum at Halicarnassus, or the other pyramid graves along the Nile. As quickly as possible, Alexandros arranged for the government of the Babylonian province. Keeping his promise, he reopened the great temple of Bel and that of Marduk, and attended the opening himself. In the palace he installed the hostage family of Darius. The handsome wife of that Persian monarch had died in childbirth during the journey. Being pregnant when she was captured at Issus, Alexandros had taken pains to give her a ceremonious burial. While he inspected the shipping along the narrow canal that bisected Babylon, connecting the metropolis with the Tigris, he sat late at night with the surveyors, hearing the account of the Babylonian revenue agents, who told him of lands stretching south to a great gulf or inland sea, and of roads that penetrated the mountain wall to the east. Beyond those mountains, the Babylonians said that he would find the other three capital cities of the empire, where the Gaza Phalakia, or imperial treasures, were kept, in Susa, Persepolis, and Ecbatana, so his Greek secretary wrote down the names. The treasure in Babylon he confiscated. With a few words, he disposed of the administration, leaving the viceroy at Darius Mosei in charge, with a Macedonian officer and a small garrison. The schools, the temples, the tithes, and the charities of the metropolis were to remain as they had been before, until his return. In Babylon, with the touch of malice, he left the women, the heavier baggage of the army, and the loot that had been collected at Gaugamela. He left here his own favorite actors, who staged plays on the journeys, and the Athenian lady, Thais, who belonged to Ptolemy. He gave orders sharply, hurrying preparations for the road, playing the new part of despot of the East. At the end of work, in the hot nights, he stripped and went swimming in the river. After drying off, he liked to sit out on one of the lofty terraces, watching the lights in the tall buildings and listening to the interpreters explaining how Chaldeans had completed their tables of the known stars. He drank a little wine, while his officers drank much, and they were not keen as Alexandros for the long mountain marches ahead. With winter closing in on them, they did not care that somewhere to the east lay the greater barrier of the Peloponnesus, marking the edge of the known world, and then the further edge of the known world. And now we have planets that we want to go out and capture, right? Always the dark-eyed. Well, we're not accomplishing it too soon. Always the dark-eyed Macedon watched his new lord, who had arrived in Darius's chariot and had occupied the royal palace. He heard that the Macedonian officers, just about that, saying just how Alexandros was making himself into a great king. Instead of one Darius, Macedon said once, he may be making himself into many Alexandroses. What's the plural of Alexander? When they marched from Babylon through the Ishtar Gate and turned east along the highway up into the mountains, they met a messenger bearing a letter from the officer who had hurried on and advanced to Susa. He reported that Susa welcomed Alexandros and that all the imperial revenues and store within that city would be kept sealed against his arrival. Susa projected from the hills like the Acropolis at Athens, with the main citadel surrounded by the hillside suburbs straggling up from the river. It had been the favorite resort of the great kings during the spring and fall, as Babylon had been their winter residence. The treasure there amounted to 50,000 talents, equal to the yield of the Macedonian armies for 50 years. There also they found statues that Xerxes had carried off from Athens generations before. Among them were the bronze figures of Harmodius and Aristogeiton. Alexandros sent them back to Athens. It seemed to the Macedonians to be a good omen to find these statues, which rejoiced Lysippus so far within the eastern mountains, and when Alexandros allowed them to celebrate with field sports and a torch race, they were more than willing to push it on in winter, not caring that they were leaving behind them the escape route to the now distant coast. Even in autumn it was too hot in Susa to please the Macedonian highlanders. Susa stood not far above the modern Ahwaz. Here the sun fries everything not in the shade, they complained. When lizards cross the stones of the street, they are fried before they can get across. We don't have to cook meat here. We only lay it out on the stones. The ancient Egyptians cooked on dark stones too, and some of those Persian deserts get really hot. Chapter 13, Persepolis. The 4 capital cities of the great kings have been capitals of different nationalities in the past. Susa, perhaps the oldest, had been the vital center of Elam. If you watch my Ekankar playlist, there's meaning to that, but not quite the context, right? Ecbatana, modern Hamadan, had been the great city of the tribal Medes. Babylon had been the metropolis of the Neo-Babylonians, who had risen along with the Medes upon the ruins of Assyrian power. Only Persepolis, city of the Persians, had been built by the great kings in their homeland, upon the Persian plateau itself. The Macedonians were now marching against time towards the heart of Persia itself, hoping to arrive there before Darius could mobilize new manpower to meet them. Leaving the foothills around Susa, they struck into the first of the long valleys that threaded through the mountain wall. They were heading southeast as they climbed, and immediately they ran into a bit of comedy. Independent tribes of these highlands, living upon sheep and cattle, had been accustomed to exact a toll from dignitaries using the highway. These Huzha, the Greek called them Uxii tribes, very much like those of the same regions today, were poorly informed about the political changes in the outer world. While they clung steadfastly to their own ancient privileges, they sent word to Alexandros that he would not be allowed to pass through with his forces unless he paid to the Huzha the toll customarily paid by the great king. Now, for the most part, people in their news is actually more of a disturbance than a help. So it's good that some people are basically keeping to what concerns their country, or their land, or their town, or their homestead. You know,